Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow as he stacked the last case of bottled water in the back storage room of Henderson's General Store, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights above creating a monotonous soundtrack to what he assumed would be another ordinary Tuesday evening in the small town of Millbrook, Colorado. The 34-year-old former military medic had taken this job 6 months ago, seeking the quiet life after 3 tours overseas, but as he glanced at the wall-mounted television displaying breaking news alerts about mysterious attacks in Denver, he felt that familiar knot of unease settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd learned to trust during his time in combat zones. The news anchor, Rebecca Martinez, was struggling to maintain her professional composure as she reported on what authorities were calling isolated incidents of extreme violence, though the shaky cell phone footage being broadcast showed something far more disturbing than typical criminal activity: people attacking others with an animalistic ferocity, seemingly impervious to pain, their movements erratic and unnatural. In the front of the store, elderly shop owner Frank Henderson was arguing with his daughter Jessica, a 28-year-old nurse who had just finished her shift at Millbrook Medical Center, about whether they should close early and head home, while outside the large front windows, the usually peaceful main street was eerily quiet except for the distant wail of sirens that had been growing more frequent throughout the day. Marcus's military training kicked in as he noticed the subtle signs of panic beginning to spread through their small community, the way Mrs. Patterson from the diner next door kept peering through her blinds, how the gas station across the street had a line of cars stretching around the block, and most telling of all, the fact that Deputy Williams had driven past their store 3 times in the last hour, his patrol car moving faster each time. The tension became palpable when Jessica's phone buzzed with an emergency alert that caused her face to drain of color as she read aloud the message from the hospital: "All off-duty medical personnel report immediately, multiple casualties from unknown viral outbreak, extreme caution advised." Before anyone could fully process this information, the store's glass door chimed as it burst open, and in stumbled Tom Bradley, the local mechanic, his work shirt torn and bloodied, his eyes wide with terror as he gasped about his coworker Dave attacking him in the garage, like some kind of rabid animal. But as Tom collapsed against the counter, Marcus noticed something wrong with the man's breathing pattern and the strange gray pallor creeping across his skin. Frank moved to help Tom, but Marcus instinctively stepped forward, his medical training raising red flags about the mechanic's symptoms: the dilated pupils, the discolored veins visible beneath his skin, and most disturbing of all, the way Tom's breathing was becoming increasingly irregular, almost stopping entirely before resuming in sudden, violent gasps. Outside, the peaceful evening was shattered by screams echoing from somewhere near the residential area behind the store, followed by the sound of car crashes and what Marcus recognized as gunfire, though he hoped desperately that he was wrong about that last part. Jessica moved toward Tom with her medical bag, but Marcus caught her arm, his voice low and urgent as he warned her to keep her distance, explaining that whatever had happened to Tom might be contagious, a theory that gained horrifying credibility when Tom suddenly stopped breathing altogether for nearly 30 seconds before his eyes snapped open, revealing pupils that had turned completely white. The next few moments unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Tom's body began to convulse violently before he lunged at Frank with inhuman speed, his teeth bared in a snarl that no longer sounded human, while outside the windows, more figures began appearing on Main Street, neighbors and townspeople Marcus had known for months, but now moving with that same unnatural, predatory gait that Tom was displaying. Marcus tackled Tom away from Frank, using his military combat training to subdue the infected man, but the struggle revealed the horrifying truth about their situation when Tom showed no response to pain, no signs of rational thought, only an overwhelming drive to attack and bite anything living within reach. As Jessica screamed and Frank scrambled for the hunting rifle he kept behind the counter, Marcus realized that their quiet mountain town had become ground zero for something far worse than any enemy he had faced in his military service, an enemy that turned friends and neighbors into mindless predators, an enemy that seemed to be spreading with terrifying speed through their community, and an enemy that had just transformed their safe, familiar world into a battleground where survival would depend on their ability to fight not just for their own lives, but for the very essence of their humanity. The sound of the rifle bolts sliding into place echoed through the store as Frank took aim, his hands shaking but his resolve firm, while outside the infected continued to gather, their numbers growing with each passing minute, and Marcus knew that this moment marked the end of their old lives and the beginning of a fight that would test everything they thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and what it truly means to be human. The thunderous crack of Frank's hunting rifle shattered the tense silence in Henderson's general store, and Tom Bradley's body crumpled to the linoleum floor, finally still after his terrifying transformation, while outside the front windows, the sound seemed to attract even more of the infected, who began pressing their faces against the glass with an intensity that made Jessica's blood run cold. Marcus immediately moved to secure the front door, flipping the deadbolt and pulling down the metal security grate that Frank typically used only during severe weather, his military instincts taking over as he assessed their defensive position and realized they were essentially trapped in a building with large windows and only 2 exits. Frank stood frozen, the smoking rifle still pointed at where Tom had been standing, his weathered hands trembling as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. He had known Tom Bradley since the man was a teenager, had watched him grow up in this town, and now he had been forced to end his life to protect his own daughter. Jessica knelt beside her father, gently taking the rifle from his shaking grip while fighting back tears, her nursing training helping her compartmentalize the trauma as she focused on the immediate threat of the growing crowd of infected townspeople who were now beginning to pound against the windows with increasing violence. Marcus grabbed his phone and tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect, and when he checked for cell service, he discovered that all communication networks seemed to be down, leaving them completely cut off from any outside help or information about what was happening in the rest of the world. The situation became more desperate when they recognized faces in the crowd outside: Mrs. Chen from the bakery, teenage Billy Watson from down the street, and most heartbreakingly, elderly Mrs. Patterson from the diner, all of them now displaying the same vacant white eyes and predatory behavior that had consumed Tom Bradley. Frank finally found his voice, suggesting they barricade the windows while they figured out a plan, and Marcus began moving shelving units and heavy merchandise to reinforce their defenses, his mind racing through possible escape routes and survival strategies he had learned during his military service. Jessica volunteered to check the store's medical supplies, knowing they would need first aid materials for whatever came next, and as she gathered bandages, antiseptic, and painkillers from the small pharmacy section, she tried to process the medical implications of what they had witnessed: the rapid onset of symptoms, the complete loss of cognitive function, and most disturbing of all, the apparent clinical death followed by reanimation. The infected outside seemed to possess a collective intelligence despite their individual lack of rational thought, as they began coordinating their attacks on different sections of the building simultaneously, testing for weak points in their defenses with a persistence that suggested this wasn't random violence but some kind of survival instinct gone horribly wrong. Marcus discovered that the store's back exit led to a narrow alley that connected to the main road behind the building, offering a potential escape route if they could clear the immediate area of infected, though the growing sounds of chaos from throughout the town suggested that running might only lead them into more danger. Frank revealed that he had been preparing for emergencies long before this outbreak, keeping additional ammunition, emergency food supplies, and basic survival gear in a hidden compartment beneath the store's floor, materials that could keep them alive for several days if they remained trapped. The 3 survivors worked together to create a more secure environment, using their different skills and knowledge to transform the small store into a temporary fortress. Marcus applied his military tactical training to improve their defensive positions, Jessica used her medical expertise to treat a minor cut Frank had sustained while moving furniture, and Frank's intimate knowledge of the building structure helped them identify the strongest areas to defend. As darkness began to fall outside, the infected seemed to become more agitated and aggressive, their pounding against the windows growing more violent and coordinated, forcing the survivors to realize that whatever was driving these creatures became stronger or more focused when daylight disappeared. Jessica made the disturbing observation that the infected retained some muscle memory and basic motor functions, noting how Mrs. Patterson was still wearing her diner apron and how Billy Watson kept making the same repetitive hand gestures he used when skateboarding, suggesting that some part of their original personalities remained trapped within their transformed bodies. Marcus proposed that they needed to gather intelligence about the scope of the outbreak and find other survivors, suggesting they could use the store's old radio system to try communicating with anyone else who might be alive and fighting this nightmare. The sound of breaking glass from the hardware store across the street reminded them that their sanctuary was only temporary, and Frank made the difficult decision to share something he had hoped never to reveal. Hidden beneath the store was a small bunker he had built during his paranoid phase after his wife's death, stocked with supplies that could sustain them for weeks if necessary. As they prepared to descend into Frank's secret refuge, Jessica spotted something that gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt all evening: a flashlight signal coming from the second floor of the apartment building 2 blocks away, blinking in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, suggesting that somewhere in their devastated town, other people were still alive, still thinking, still fighting to survive the impossible nightmare that had consumed their peaceful community in a matter of hours. The narrow wooden stairs creaked under their weight as Marcus, Jessica, and Frank descended into the hidden bunker beneath Henderson's general store, the musty air thick with the scent of preserved food and old concrete, while above them the muffled sounds of the infected continued their relentless assault on the building they had just abandoned. Frank's secret refuge proved to be more extensive than any of them had imagined, a well-organized underground space complete with battery-powered radio equipment, shelves lined with canned goods and medical supplies, water filtration systems, and even a small arsenal of hunting rifles and ammunition that Frank had accumulated over the years since his wife Martha's death had left him obsessed with preparing for unknown disasters. Jessica immediately moved to the radio equipment, her fingers working to adjust the frequencies while Marcus helped Frank secure the concealed entrance above them, both men listening anxiously for any sounds that might indicate the infected had discovered their hiding place. The first breakthrough came when Jessica managed to pick up a weak signal from the apartment building where they had seen the flashlight, and after several minutes of careful communication, they established contact with a group of 4 survivors: Detective Ray Morrison, who had been off duty when the outbreak began, local high school teacher Amanda Walsh, her teenage student Kevin Rodriguez who had been tutoring after school, and Dr. Elizabeth Harper from the medical center who had escaped when the hospital became overrun with infected patients. Detective Morrison's voice crackled through the radio as he described what he had witnessed during the initial outbreak. The infected seemed to be drawn to sound and movement but appeared to have difficulty with certain frequencies, and he had noticed that they moved more slowly in colder temperatures, suggesting that their reanimated bodies retained some basic physiological responses to environmental conditions. Dr. Harper added crucial medical insight through the radio transmission, explaining that she had observed the infection spreading through bite wounds with an incubation period that varied from person to person, ranging from minutes to several hours, and she had documented cases where individuals with certain blood types seemed to resist the infection longer than others, though ultimately everyone succumbed if exposed. Marcus shared his military observations about the infected's behavior patterns, noting that they seemed to operate on basic predatory instincts but lacked strategic thinking, making them vulnerable to simple diversions and traps, while their apparent inability to climb or navigate complex obstacles suggested that elevated positions could provide temporary safety. The 2 groups spent the next several hours coordinating their resources and information, with Frank's bunker serving as a communication hub while Detective Morrison's group used their elevated position to observe the infected's movements throughout the town, mapping safe corridors and identifying patterns in their behavior that could be exploited. Jessica made a disturbing discovery when she analyzed the timeline of infections they had witnessed. The virus or whatever was causing the outbreak seemed to be mutating or adapting, with newer infected showing slightly different characteristics than the earlier cases, including increased aggression and what appeared to be improved coordination among groups. Dr. Harper's medical expertise proved invaluable when she guided Marcus through treating a minor injury Frank had sustained, and during their radio conversation, she revealed that she had managed to collect blood samples from infected individuals before escaping the hospital, samples that might hold the key to understanding how the infection spread and potentially how to combat it. The alliance between the 2 groups strengthened when they successfully coordinated a rescue operation for Mrs. Gloria Davis, an elderly woman trapped in her house 3 blocks away, using Frank's knowledge of the town's layout, Marcus's tactical skills, and Detective Morrison's law enforcement experience to create a diversion that drew the infected away from her location long enough for Kevin Rodriguez to reach her through a series of connected rooftops. During this operation, they made several critical discoveries about the infected's weaknesses. Bright lights seemed to disorient them temporarily, loud noises could be used to herd them in specific directions, and most importantly, they appeared to lose interest in prey that remained completely motionless for extended periods, suggesting that their hunting instincts were triggered primarily by movement and sound rather than scent. Frank surprised everyone by revealing that his late wife Martha had been a research scientist who had worked on viral outbreaks for the Centers for Disease Control, and among her personal papers hidden in the bunker, they found protocols for containing biological threats that could potentially be adapted to their current situation. The group's morale received a significant boost when Amanda Walsh reported seeing smoke signals from the direction of the old fire station on the outskirts of town, indicating that their growing alliance might include even more survivors, possibly including firefighters with additional resources and training that could prove crucial in their fight for survival. As the night wore on, the two groups continued to share intelligence and coordinate their activities, with Jessica documenting everything in a journal that she hoped might someday help other communities if this outbreak spread beyond their small town, while Marcus began formulating plans for a more organized resistance movement that could potentially reclaim sections of Millbrook from the infected hordes. Dr. Harper's analysis of the infection patterns led to a chilling realization that would shape their future strategy. The outbreak was not random but seemed to be following specific population centers and transportation routes, suggesting either an engineered biological weapon or a naturally occurring pathogen that had found the perfect conditions to spread, meaning their isolated mountain community might just be the beginning of something far more catastrophic than any of them had initially imagined. The crackling voice of a government official broadcasting over emergency radio frequencies at dawn brought the first real hope the survivors had felt since the outbreak began, as the authoritative tone announced the establishment of a secure evacuation zone at the Millbrook Regional Airport, complete with military protection, medical facilities, and transport to uninfected areas outside the contamination zone. Marcus listened intently to the broadcast from Frank's bunker, his military experience making him naturally skeptical of promises that sounded too good to be true, while Jessica and Frank began gathering their essential supplies with renewed energy, desperate to believe that their nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Detective Morrison's voice crackled through their radio communication, reporting that his group could see military vehicles and helicopters in the distance near the airport, lending credibility to the official broadcast, though he noted that the activity seemed oddly limited for what should be a major evacuation operation. Dr. Harper expressed concern about the timing of the announcement, pointing out that establishing a secure perimeter around an airport would typically take much longer than the few hours since the outbreak began, and she questioned whether any government agency could have mobilized resources so quickly in response to what appeared to be an unprecedented biological crisis. Despite these reservations, the combined groups decided to attempt reaching the evacuation zone, with Marcus and Detective Morrison developing a coordinated movement plan that would allow both groups to travel together through the least infected areas of town while maintaining radio contact throughout their journey. The morning sun revealed the true extent of the devastation in Millbrook as the survivors carefully made their way through back alleys and side streets toward the airport, passing abandoned vehicles, ransacked buildings, and the scattered remains of their former neighbors who had been either consumed by the infected or transformed into the shambling hordes that continued to wander aimlessly through the town. Frank struggled with leaving behind the store and bunker that had been his life's work, but Jessica convinced him that survival meant adaptation, and their small group of 7 survivors moved methodically toward what they hoped would be salvation, carrying backpacks filled with medical supplies, ammunition, and the precious blood samples that Dr. Harper had collected from infected individuals. Kevin Rodriguez proved invaluable as a scout, his youthful agility allowing him to climb structures and survey areas ahead of the group, and it was his sharp eyes that first noticed something troubling about the supposed military checkpoint they could see in the distance. The vehicles appeared to be civilian trucks painted in military colors rather than actual government equipment. Amanda Walsh, who had taught government classes for 15 years, pointed out that the checkpoint's organization seemed chaotic and unprofessional, lacking the systematic approach she would expect from trained military personnel, and she noticed that the uniformed figures moving around the perimeter appeared to be carrying a mixture of military and civilian weapons rather than standard-issue equipment. Marcus used his military training to observe the checkpoint through Frank's hunting binoculars, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The supposed soldiers were wearing mismatched uniforms, their movements lacked proper military discipline, and most damning of all, he could see several infected individuals shambling around within the checkpoint perimeter, apparently ignored by the guards who should have been protecting the evacuation zone. Dr. Harper's medical expertise proved crucial when she pointed out that any legitimate evacuation center would have established strict quarantine protocols to prevent infected individuals from entering the safe zone, yet the checkpoint ahead showed no evidence of medical screening procedures or containment measures that would be standard in a real emergency response operation. Detective Morrison's law enforcement background helped him recognize other red flags about the supposed safe zone: the lack of proper identification procedures, the absence of official communication protocols, and most concerning of all, the fact that he could see several civilian vehicles parked inside the perimeter with their doors hanging open, as if their occupants had been forcibly removed from their vehicles. The group made the difficult decision to observe the checkpoint from a hidden position rather than approach directly, and over the next several hours, they witnessed a horrifying pattern. Small groups of desperate survivors would arrive at the checkpoint seeking evacuation, only to be disarmed by the fake soldiers and herded into what appeared to be holding areas where they were systematically robbed of their supplies and left to fend for themselves among the infected who roamed freely within the compound. Jessica felt sick as she realized that whoever was running this operation was using people's hope and desperation against them, creating a trap that preyed on survivors' most basic need for safety and rescue, while simultaneously gathering resources and supplies from those foolish enough to trust the false promises of salvation. Marcus's military training helped him identify the true nature of their opposition. This was likely a group of opportunistic criminals or perhaps even infected individuals who retained enough cognitive function to operate a complex deception, using the chaos of the outbreak to prey on other survivors while masquerading as legitimate authority figures. The devastating realization that there might be no real government response, no legitimate safe zones, and no organized effort to contain the outbreak forced the group to confront the possibility that they were truly on their own in this new world, dependent entirely on their own skills, resources, and determination to survive not just the infected hordes but also the human predators who had emerged from the collapse of civilization. As they carefully retreated from the false checkpoint, Dr. Harper voiced what they were all thinking. If they couldn't trust official broadcasts or apparent government operations, they would need to create their own safe zone, develop their own survival strategies, and build their own community of trustworthy allies who could work together to reclaim some small piece of their world from the chaos that had consumed everything they once knew and trusted. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Millbrook's downtown district had been forgotten by most residents since the transit project was cancelled 15 years ago, but Marcus realized these concrete corridors could provide the perfect hidden network for moving between safe locations without exposing themselves to the infected hordes that continued to multiply on the surface. Dr. Harper's medical analysis of the blood samples had revealed disturbing evidence that the infection was evolving rapidly, with newer variants showing increased intelligence and problem-solving abilities that made traditional evasion tactics less effective, forcing their group of survivors to adapt their strategies constantly just to stay alive. Detective Morrison had discovered during his reconnaissance missions that several other survivor groups were operating throughout the region, including a well-organized faction led by former Army Captain Michael Stevens who had established a fortified compound in the old mining facility north of town, though initial radio contact suggested that Stevens' group was extremely territorial and potentially hostile to outsiders. Jessica's nursing background proved invaluable when they encountered a wounded survivor named Danny Martinez, a former construction worker who had been hiding in the tunnel system for days after escaping from what he described as a collection camp, where infected individuals were being gathered and studied by a mysterious group of people in hazmat suits who seemed to understand far more about the outbreak than they were letting on. Danny's account of systematic capture and experimentation suggested that someone with significant resources and scientific knowledge was actively studying the infection, possibly even working to weaponize or control it, which raised terrifying questions about whether the outbreak was truly accidental or part of some larger planned operation. Frank's knowledge of the town's underground infrastructure became crucial as he guided the group through forgotten maintenance tunnels, abandoned basements, and hidden passages that connected many of the downtown buildings, creating a secret highway that allowed them to gather supplies and rescue isolated survivors without alerting the growing populations of infected on the surface. Amanda Walsh discovered that several of her former students had survived the initial outbreak and were hiding in various locations throughout the town, including twins Jake and Jenny Foster who had barricaded themselves in the school's chemistry lab, where they had been experimenting with various compounds that seemed to repel or disorient the infected, though their amateur chemical work posed significant safety risks. Kevin Rodriguez's youth and agility made him the perfect messenger for establishing communication between different survivor groups, and during one of his scouting missions, he discovered that the infected were beginning to organize into larger groups with what appeared to be a primitive hierarchy, with certain individuals displaying leadership behaviors that suggested the virus was not simply destroying intelligence but perhaps redirecting it toward collective survival instincts. Dr. Harper made a breakthrough discovery when she analyzed tissue samples from recently infected individuals and found evidence of rapid cellular regeneration that explained why the infected could continue functioning despite severe physical damage, but more disturbing was her finding that some infected retained significant cognitive abilities while appearing to be mindless, suggesting they might be consciously choosing to hide their intelligence from living humans. The underground network the survivors were building faced its first major test when they attempted to rescue a group of elderly residents trapped in the basement of Millbrook Assisted Living, only to discover that one of the facility's staff members, Nurse Patricia Coleman, had been infected for several days but was successfully concealing her condition while gathering information about their rescue operations and the locations of other survivor groups. Marcus's military training helped him recognize the tactical implications of Patricia's deception. If infected individuals could maintain their human appearance and behavior while secretly working against survivor communities, then paranoia and mistrust would become as dangerous as the infected themselves, potentially destroying the cooperation and solidarity that were essential for long-term survival. The revelation of Patricia's hidden infection forced the group to develop new protocols for identifying compromised individuals, including medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and careful observation of behavior patterns, though Dr. Harper warned that these measures might not be sufficient if the infection continued to evolve and produce more sophisticated variants. Detective Morrison uncovered evidence that several missing persons from their community had been taken by the mysterious group Danny had described, and surveillance of their suspected base of operations revealed heavily armed personnel using advanced equipment to capture both infected and uninfected individuals for unknown purposes, suggesting that their small-town outbreak was connected to much larger forces with resources and capabilities far beyond what local survivors could hope to match. Frank made the difficult decision to reveal another secret from his past. His late wife Martha had not simply worked for the CDC but had been involved in classified biological warfare research, and among her hidden papers were protocols for creating safe rooms, communication networks, and resistance cells that could operate effectively during biological emergencies. Knowledge that could help their growing alliance survive and potentially fight back against both the infected and their human enemies. The underground tunnels that had seemed like salvation began to feel like a trap when the group discovered that the infected were learning to use these same passages, with evidence suggesting that some of them retained enough memory and intelligence to remember the tunnel layouts from their previous human lives, turning the survivors' secret highways into potential hunting grounds where they could be cornered and overwhelmed. As their network of allies expanded to include nearly 30 survivors spread across multiple secure locations, Jessica realized that their greatest challenge was no longer simply staying alive but determining who among their supposed allies could be trusted, who might be infected and hiding it, and who might be working with the mysterious forces that seemed to be orchestrating events from behind the scenes, treating their community's survival as nothing more than an experiment in a much larger and more sinister plan. Marcus stood before a makeshift map spread across the concrete floor of their main underground headquarters, the candlelight flickering across hand-drawn diagrams that represented 3 weeks of careful intelligence gathering about both the infected populations and the mysterious organization that had been conducting capture operations throughout the region. The 37 survivors who had joined their network represented a diverse mix of skills and backgrounds that Marcus realized could be transformed from a desperate group of refugees into an effective resistance force, if they could overcome their fear and coordinate their efforts against enemies who had grown overconfident in their apparent technological and numerical superiority. Dr. Harper's continued analysis of blood samples and behavioral observations had revealed crucial weaknesses in the infected that could be exploited tactically. Their reliance on sound and movement for hunting made them vulnerable to acoustic diversions. Their pack mentality meant that eliminating leader types could scatter entire groups, and most importantly, their cellular regeneration abilities were significantly reduced in temperatures below freezing, suggesting that winter weather could provide a natural advantage for human survivors. Detective Morrison had successfully infiltrated the perimeter of the mysterious organization's base facility by posing as a captured survivor, and his reconnaissance revealed that their operation was far more extensive than anyone had imagined: underground laboratories, holding facilities for both infected and uninfected subjects, and communication equipment that suggested coordination with similar facilities in other regions, indicating that Millbrook was just one testing ground in a much larger experimental program. Frank's knowledge of the town's infrastructure became the foundation for an ambitious plan that would simultaneously disrupt the organization's operations while creating defensible territories for the survivor communities, using his detailed understanding of power grids, water systems, and transportation networks to identify critical points where sabotage could maximum impact with minimal risk to their own people. Jessica had emerged as the group's de facto coordinator, her nursing background giving her natural authority when making life-or-death decisions, and she proposed that their counterattack should focus not just on survival but on gathering evidence of the organization's activities that could be transmitted to outside authorities, assuming any legitimate government agencies still existed beyond their contaminated region. Amanda Walsh contributed her teaching experience to develop training programs that could quickly prepare civilian survivors for combat operations, recognizing that their success would depend on transforming frightened refugees into disciplined fighters who could execute complex coordinated attacks against enemies with superior equipment and training. Kevin Rodriguez had proven himself as the network's most effective scout and saboteur, and his reconnaissance missions revealed that the organization's security was weakest during shift changes at dawn and dusk, when their personnel movements followed predictable patterns that could be exploited by small teams of survivors who understood the local terrain better than their enemies. Dr. Harper made a breakthrough discovery when she successfully synthesized a compound using materials from the high school chemistry lab that could temporarily mask human scent and heat signatures from infected detection, giving their fighters a crucial advantage during stealth operations while also providing potential escape options if missions went wrong. The twins Jake and Jenny Foster had continued their chemical experiments under Dr. Harper's supervision, developing improvised weapons and deterrents that could level the playing field against the organization's advanced equipment, including smoke grenades that confused infected senses and corrosive compounds that could disable electronic surveillance systems. Danny Martinez proved invaluable as their primary intelligence source about the organization's internal operations, having retained detailed memories of the facility layout, personnel schedules, and security protocols from his time as a captive, information that Marcus used to identify the most vulnerable targets for their initial strikes. Marcus's military training became the backbone of their strategic planning as he developed a three-phase operation that would begin with sabotage attacks on the organization's supply lines and communication networks, followed by coordinated strikes on their outlying facilities, and culminating in a full assault on their main base that would either destroy their operation or force them to abandon the region entirely. The psychological impact of transitioning from victims to aggressors proved as important as the tactical advantages, as survivors who had spent weeks living in fear began to experience hope and determination that strengthened their resolve and improved their effectiveness during training exercises and preliminary operations. Detective Morrison's law enforcement experience complemented Marcus's military background perfectly, providing expertise in urban warfare, building clearing procedures, and crowd control that would be essential when they began operations in areas where infected populations remained active alongside the organization's personnel. Frank surprised everyone by revealing that Martha's CDC papers included detailed information about biological containment protocols and decontamination procedures that could potentially be used to create safe zones where survivors could live without constant fear of infection, giving their resistance movement a long-term goal beyond simple vengeance against their enemies. The group's first major test came when they successfully coordinated a simultaneous attack on 3 of the organization's remote observation posts, using diversionary tactics to draw away infected while small teams of survivors destroyed equipment and gathered intelligence, proving that their training and planning could translate into effective action against formidable opponents. Jessica documented everything in her journal with the growing conviction that their story needed to be preserved and shared, not just as a record of their survival but as proof that ordinary people could resist extraordinary evil when they worked together with courage, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance to reclaim their freedom and their future from those who would treat human life as nothing more than experimental data in pursuit of their own twisted goals. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as Marcus led a team of 12 survivors through the frozen woods toward the Millbrook Broadcasting Station, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air while the distant glow of floodlights revealed that the mysterious organization had converted the facility into a major communication hub, complete with additional antenna arrays and heavily armed guards who seemed unaware that their every movement had been observed and catalogued by Kevin Rodriguez during weeks of careful surveillance. Jessica remained at the Underground Command Center coordinating simultaneous diversionary attacks across the region, her voice crackling through their radio headsets as she confirmed that Detective Morrison's team had successfully triggered explosions at the organization's fuel depot, drawing significant personnel away from the broadcasting station just as Marcus had predicted in their carefully orchestrated battle plan. Dr. Harper had insisted on joining the assault team despite the obvious dangers, arguing that her medical expertise would be essential if they encountered more evidence of biological experimentation, and she carried a specially designed collection kit that could preserve samples of any research materials they discovered while also providing emergency medical treatment for wounded team members. Frank moved with surprising agility for his age as he guided the team through maintenance tunnels that connected to the broadcasting station's basement levels, his intimate knowledge of the region's infrastructure proving invaluable as they bypassed several security checkpoints and motion sensors that would have alerted the guards to their presence. The twins Jake and Jenny Foster had spent the previous evening preparing specialized explosive devices using materials salvaged from the high school chemistry lab, and their improvised bombs were designed to disable electronic equipment without creating the massive fires that might attract infected hordes from throughout the surrounding area. Amanda Walsh commanded a secondary team positioned on the ridge overlooking the facility, armed with hunting rifles and tasked with providing covering fire while also serving as spotters who could warn the assault team about enemy reinforcements or unexpected movements by the infected who continued to wander through the area despite the organization's security measures. Danny Martinez proved his value once again by identifying the exact locations of critical communication equipment based on his memories of similar facilities he had seen during his captivity, and his intelligence allowed Marcus to develop precise targeting priorities that would maximize damage to the organization's operations while minimizing the time his team would be exposed to enemy fire. The first phase of the assault proceeded flawlessly as Marcus's team penetrated the facility's lower levels and began systematically destroying backup power systems and communication relays. But their progress was complicated when they discovered that several rooms contained holding cells filled with both infected and uninfected prisoners who had been subjected to various medical procedures that Dr. Harper found deeply disturbing. Kevin Rodriguez demonstrated remarkable courage when he volunteered to remain behind and guide the rescued prisoners to safety through the tunnel system, even though this meant he would miss the main assault and face the dangerous journey back to their base while potentially pursued by both enemy personnel and infected who might be attracted by the group's movement. The battle intensified dramatically when the organization's guards finally detected the assault and began coordinating a counterattack that included not only heavily armed personnel but also weaponized infected who appeared to be under some form of remote control, suggesting that the mysterious group had achieved a breakthrough in their biological research that made them far more dangerous than the survivors had anticipated. Marcus found himself fighting a two-front war as his team tried to reach the main broadcasting equipment while simultaneously defending against both human enemies who possessed superior firepower and infected attackers who showed tactical coordination that seemed impossible based on everything they had previously observed about the virus's effects on cognitive function. Dr. Harper made a horrifying discovery in the facility's main laboratory when she found detailed research notes documenting successful experiments in controlling infected behavior through electronic implants, along with plans for expanding these techniques to create armies of controlled infected that could be directed against specific targets while remaining obedient to their handlers. Frank's demolition skills became crucial when the team realized that simply destroying the broadcasting equipment would not be sufficient. They needed to bring down the entire facility to prevent the organization from rebuilding their operation, and his knowledge of structural weak points allowed them to place the Foster twins' explosives for maximum effect while ensuring they could escape before the building collapsed. The mission reached its climax when Marcus discovered that the broadcasting station was actively transmitting false emergency signals designed to lure survivor groups into traps similar to the fake evacuation zone they had encountered weeks earlier, and he realized that destroying this facility could save countless lives by preventing other communities from falling victim to the same deceptions that had claimed so many of Millbrook's residents. Amanda Walsh's covering fire proved essential during their desperate escape as enemy reinforcements arrived and began pursuing the assault team through the tunnel system, her accurate shooting buying precious time for the explosives to detonate while Marcus helped carry a wounded Danny Martinez who had been injured during the final phase of the mission. The massive explosion that destroyed the broadcasting station sent shockwaves through the underground tunnels and created a spectacular fireball that could be seen for miles, serving not only as confirmation of their success but also as a signal to survivor communities throughout the region that organized resistance was possible and that the mysterious organization was not invincible despite their advanced technology and apparent resources. The destruction of the broadcasting station marked the beginning of a cascade of victories across the region as other survivor communities, inspired by the massive explosion they had witnessed and encouraged by the cessation of false emergency broadcasts, began launching their own coordinated attacks against the mysterious organization's remaining facilities, creating a network of resistance that stretched far beyond Millbrook and demonstrated that ordinary people could prevail against seemingly insurmountable odds when they refused to surrender their humanity to fear and despair. Marcus found himself transformed from a reluctant survivor into a recognized leader as representatives from dozens of communities sought his guidance in planning operations against the organization, and he established a training center in the renovated mining facility where former Army Captain Michael Stevens had finally agreed to join their alliance after witnessing the effectiveness of their tactics. Dr. Harper's medical research took on new significance when she successfully developed a reliable test for detecting the early stages of infection, allowing communities to implement quarantine protocols that could prevent outbreaks while also providing hope for those who had been exposed but not yet turned. And her work with the Foster twins led to the creation of treatments that could slow the infection's progress and potentially give victims time to say goodbye to their loved ones. Jessica's documentation efforts evolved into a comprehensive manual for survivor communities that detailed everything from tactical operations and medical procedures to psychological support and community organization, and her journal became the foundation for a communication network that connected isolated groups across multiple states, sharing vital information about threats, resources, and successful survival strategies. Frank's expertise in infrastructure became the cornerstone of an ambitious reconstruction project that aimed to restore power, water, and communication systems to liberated areas, and his teams of volunteer engineers worked tirelessly to create the foundation for a new society that could thrive despite the continued presence of infected populations in remote areas. The mysterious organization's collapse accelerated rapidly after the loss of their primary communication hub, as internal conflicts emerged between different factions within their ranks and their controlled infected began breaking free from electronic restraints, turning against their former handlers in an ironic reversal that demonstrated the inherent instability of trying to weaponize biological chaos. Amanda Walsh established the new Millbrook Academy in a repurposed warehouse where survivor children could receive education alongside tactical training, ensuring that the next generation would be prepared for the challenges of their transformed world while also preserving the knowledge and values that defined human civilization before the outbreak. Kevin Rodriguez, now recognized as one of the most skilled scouts in the region, led expeditions to establish contact with survivor communities as far away as the state capital, bringing news that government agencies were slowly re-establishing control in some areas and that coordinated efforts to reclaim infected territories were showing promising results in multiple locations. Detective Morrison took charge of law enforcement in the growing alliance of communities, establishing courts and legal procedures that balanced the need for security with respect for individual rights, proving that democracy and justice could survive even in the harsh conditions created by societal collapse and ongoing biological threats. Danny Martinez became the director of intelligence operations, using his intimate knowledge of the organization's methods to help identify and neutralize remaining cells while also working to locate and rescue prisoners who remained trapped in hidden facilities that had not yet been discovered by the expanding resistance movement. The Foster twins continued their chemical research under Dr. Harper's supervision, developing new compounds that could neutralize infected in large areas without harming the environment, and their work showed promise for eventually reclaiming entire cities from the hordes that still controlled many urban centers throughout the country. Frank surprised everyone by announcing his engagement to Gloria Davis, the elderly woman they had rescued during their early operations, proving that love and hope could flourish even in the darkest circumstances and that building personal connections remained as important as tactical victories in the long struggle to rebuild their world. The first anniversary of the outbreak was marked not with mourning but with celebration, as the Alliance of Survivor Communities held a festival that brought together nearly 1,000 people from across the region, sharing food, music, and stories that demonstrated how far they had come from the terrified refugees who had once huddled in underground bunkers waiting for rescue that never came. Marcus delivered a speech during the anniversary celebration that captured the transformation of their movement from desperate survival to active reconstruction, emphasizing that their greatest victory was not the defeat of their enemies but the preservation of their humanity and their commitment to building a better society than the one that had been lost to the outbreak. Dr. Harper announced during the festival that her research team had made breakthrough discoveries about the infection's long-term effects, including evidence that some infected individuals might eventually recover their cognitive functions naturally, offering hope that the millions of transformed humans wandering the earth might someday return to their families and communities. Jessica concluded her journal with reflections on how their small group of survivors had grown into a thriving alliance that controlled territory spanning 3 states, protected thousands of people, and served as a beacon of hope for isolated communities still fighting their own battles against both the infected and human predators who sought to exploit the chaos for their own gain. As winter approached and the second year of their new world began, the survivors of Millbrook looked toward the future with confidence that they had not merely survived the zombie invasion but had created something stronger and more compassionate than what they had lost, proving that hope could indeed be reclaimed even in the most broken of worlds when people chose to stand together rather than fall apart.